Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 14th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific to understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Last time, we killed and buried poor Philip II and explored how his ambitious young son consolidated power, smacked around all opposition, and cemented his place as the undisputed successor to the Macedonian throne. Despite the ranting and raving of Demosthenes down in Athens, all of Greece, except for those pesky Spartans who were, by the way, at this point, a bit of a paper tiger, bowed down in supplication. Alexander was the man, at home and in all of Greece. Over the course of this and following episodes, we will follow the career of Alexander from his invasion of Persia to his untimely and suspiciously young death. We've got about a decade to cover, but oh boy, what a decade. But before we dive in, I want to reiterate something I have mentioned both in the introduction and in a few of the episodes to date. I don't really find the detailed descriptions of battles to be particularly enthralling. This is a history more of the people than of the specific battles that they fought. So much of the fame Alex won for himself comes in the next 10 years, and much of that due to his battlefield genius. Where necessary, I will give a cursory overview of the events from some of these conflicts, but I'm more focused on getting a feel for who this guy was, what he was like, and what made him tick. It might, therefore, be more useful to talk about what he said to his troops than, say, the way he attacked an enemy's flank. Some of his tactics do show how he thought and his ability to think 3 steps ahead of everyone else, so sometimes reviewing battles will be necessary. In the time period we're here to discuss, there are a lot of battles, a lot of sieges, a lot of careening from place to place looking for a fight. In earlier episodes, such as the one on Thutmose the Great, it was sufficient to say something akin to, he led 17 campaigns, rather than to go into deep descriptions of each of these. With Alexander, it's a lot more tempting to dive down these rabbit holes because we know so much more about all of them. I'm going to try to mostly stick to the most important battles and may either gloss over or skip entirely some of the fights that don't materially contribute to this podcast episode. If you're a huge Alexander fan, and it makes you shake with rage that I skip past, say, the Battle of Jaxartes, my apologies in advance. As I have said in previous episodes, if you want to learn more about any of this, I promise the literature is bottomless. Hit me up, and we can find something to read together. But how, you might ask, do we have access to so many details in the first place? Like most history, there are some gaps filled in with conjecture or the mythologizing process that we discuss when reviewing the assassination of Philip II. However, let's remember that Alexander was deeply focused on being seen as great. His image and reputation were very important to him. As such, he brought with him an historian to mark down everything that he did, all his courageous acts, his generosity, his enlightened benevolence, etc. The guy that served this role for most of this story, Callisthenes, was a sort of publicist for Alexander. That is, until Alexander had Callisthenes killed. Don't worry, we'll get there. After Alexander died, his inner circle fell into a violent civil war for control of the empire, and several of them, largely seeking to justify their own actions in these conflicts, wrote their own biographies of Alexander to emphasize their own role in the events. The work of authors such as Callisthenes and Ptolemy, his companion and one of the winners in the post-Alexandrian power struggle, are lost, but they were available to ancient historians, and we can feel the echoes of their words today. In other words, we know a lot more about the events that followed than many other ancient historical periods, and it's largely on account of Alexander's burning and vainglorious ambition, his need to have every action written down, to have every detail noted, to have everything glorified. It's worth noting that as we dive into the apex of the life and career of Alexander the Great, that it was his own sense of greatness that gives us so many of the details that we have to tell the story. All right, enough prologue. Here we go. Just before he was killed, Philip II had been elected by the Greek city-states to the position of strategos, or commander-in-chief, for the planned invasion of Persia. This put him at the head of the combined military strength of the entire Hellenic world. Well, again, except for Sparta. It didn't exactly win him the full-fledged respect of the snobbish Hellenes, but it did vault him to the top of the power structure as the acknowledged strongman of the entire Greek world. By the time the assassin Pausanias slid his knife between Philip's ribs, 2 of his most trusted generals, Attalus and Parmenio, were already in Asia Minor with about 10,000 troops. The first phase of this plan was to liberate the Ionian Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor. If you remember back in the Cyrus the Great episodes, this was the region that had come under Persian sway following the war with King Croesus of Lydia. The Ionian Greek cities had never really taken to Persian rule, being more culturally aligned and geographically proximate to, say, Athens, Corinth, and Sparta than Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana. These cities had long chafed under Persian hegemony and were itching for their chance to overthrow the King of Kings. The two generals, Parmenio and Attalus, father and son-in-law to boot, made good progress at the outset, but then Philip went and got himself assassinated. Sheesh. This demoralized the advanced Macedonian army, and they suffered a setback in a pitched battle at the city of Magnesia. The irony is that the opposing general was not Persian, but rather a Greek mercenary. Memnon of Rhodes had opted to put his services up for hire, and he became a dedicated employee of the Persian king Darius III. Memnon was even connected to the Persian nobility through marriage. He was all in on Persia, and he spent the better part of his life in service of the Persian kings. That said, like any good empire, Persian court politics could be volatile. The shifting landscape of rivalries, pretenders, family ambitions, and the like made things uncomfortable for Memnon from time to time. By virtue of his mercenary status, he was never wholly embraced by either the Greeks or the Persians. Remember back in part 1 of this episode when we talked about the members of the Persian court drifting their way into Philip's court? Memnon was one of these guys. He spent 3 or 4 years in Pella, much of which he spent in conversation with the future king, Alexander. They knew one another well, and when Memnon left to return to Persia and resume his mercenary career, he took with him insight into the capabilities and tactics of the Macedonians. Memnon also brought back a keen appreciation for the gifted young heir apparent. Memnon's fight against the advanced units of the Macedonians got another boost when Attalus was killed by Alexander as part of his post-accession consolidation. Very anxious not to be caught on the wrong side of the conflict between the Hellenes and the Persians, many of the Ionian cities that had initially welcomed the Greeks as liberators did an about-face, threw out the pro-Greek forces, and reasserted their loyalty to Persia. It seems like the winds were shifting back in Persia's favor, and these cities did not want to incur the wrath of the Persian king of kings. After some initial successes, the Greco-Macedonian invasion had started to falter, and much of this was due to Memnon's military and political cunning. He was a worthy adversary, but despite these successes, and despite a career in service to Persia, Darius III didn't have full confidence in Memnon's loyalties. This would prove to be a mistake. By 334 BCE, Alexander was ready to get his campaign into gear. He crossed the Hellespont, the modern Dardanelles, with his massive force. After linking up with the advanced force reeling from its bashing at the hands of Memnon, the combined forces comprised nearly 50,000 infantry and more than 6,000 cavalry. To support his operations, Alexander assembled a navy of more than 100 ships, manned by more than 35,000 additional men. But these ships were principally for logistical support and did not represent a true battle navy. For the time being, the seas were one area where Persia, with a veteran and extensive navy, maintained a big advantage. More than Macedonians, Alexander's combined forces were an amalgamation of Greeks, Macedonians, Thracians, Thessalians, and Illyrians. You'll hear me refer to them as Greco-Macedonian, but remember, this is an expansive force. There were pikemen wielding the sarissa, traditional Greek phalanx soldiers called hoplites, archers, and Alexander's favorite, mounted cavalry. Atop Bucephalus, Alexander led his mighty army by personally commanding the cavalry. Alexander's specific unit was called the companion cavalry because they were the companions of the king. It numbered about 2,600 troops, and it was the elite shock cavalry unit of the ancient world. They could hit an enemy so fast, close a gap so quickly, and strike with such ferocity that simply lining up opposing them on the battlefield struck fear in their opponents. They lined up in units shaped like a spearhead. Alexander was the tip of the spear. Behind him was a row of 2. Behind them, a row of 3, then 4, and so on. These guys were good. Did I say they were good? Heck, they were a Rembrandt. But no matter how dynamic and inspiring Alexander was, he couldn't personally be everywhere at once. He needed talented subordinates to pull off his big plans. Fortunately for Alex, he had quite a few around him. We can't really tell the history of Alexander without getting to know, even if at a cursory level, some of the important people with whom Alexander surrounded himself. By the way, I often try to point out when I'm conscious that I'm really giving a brief overview of something very important or for which there are a lot of details. The names and relationships of the people that came into and out of Alexander's inner circle are such a topic. To do them all justice would turn this podcast into a book-length episode. After Alexander dies, these guys all get into a really complicated set of feuds and a really, really roiling empire-wide civil war. These are the people that fought to be the successors of Alexander the Great. They're important, complicated, and occasionally brutal. Alexander carried on a tradition from his father that the king had 7 trusted bodyguards called somatophilites. You may recall that it was when Philip gave these elite bodyguards the day off that the assassin Pausanias struck and killed the king. Drawn from the nobility of Macedonian society, these were Alexander's elite inner circle. To have a position close to the king came with great power, and in addition to protecting the king, the bodyguards took up key posts as generals or governors. Not all of Alexander's important generals were bodyguards, for example, Parmenio, but all the bodyguards were key, trusted people, hand-selected by Alexander for their competence and their loyalty. The composition of this cadre of 7 would shift over the years of Alexander's campaigns, including his appointment of an 8th for a period of time. Some left the corps because they were tasked with governing provinces conquered by Alexander and needed to stay behind to protect the king's interests. Others died, either in battle or of natural causes. At least one was executed on suspicion that he was plotting against the king. The best way for one of these guys to get one of these prize spots, aside from having ready-made impeccable social credentials, was to fight their way in, literally, proving their merit through battlefield valor. Some important people included Aristinus, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Perdiccas, and above all, at least where Alexander was concerned, Hephaestion. Some of these bodyguards had been by Alexander's side for a long, long time, including Ptolemy, who studied by Alexander during the tutorship of Aristotle. Hephaestion, too, may have been present. There is conflicting evidence if he was or was not. Regardless, Hephaestion was easily Alexander's closest friend and companion. He was also a member of the Macedonian nobility. The two grew up best friends and stayed that way for the rest of their lives, from early childhood to mastery of the known world. Theirs was a relationship similar to that of Achilles and Patroclus from the Iliad. They were so close that many people have suggested they were lovers. It's certainly possible, but no one knows. It doesn't really matter. They had a deep and abiding bond. They genuinely and truly loved and were committed to one another. Hephaestion was also tight with other members of Alexander's inner circle, even corresponding directly with Alexander's mother Olympias, and with Aristotle as well. Alexander was lauded for the depths of his thorough classical education. He was well versed in all the arts and science and math and music. He was a well-rounded, cultivated man, but he was not unique. One thing that's important to consider about the corps of bodyguards is that they all were, despite the snobbish Greek tendency to turn their noses at the Macedonians, the king and his closest companions were among the most highly educated people in the world. The king was surrounded by intelligent and sophisticated leaders. But there was one part of his education to which none of the other bodyguards were privy. To Alexander alone, the benefits fell. When Philip had hosted the various Persians at his court in Pella, it was Alexander that listened into their conversations and even, as we've seen with Memnon, conversed directly with these individuals. Through these interactions, Alexander had gained key insight about Persia from his time listening to the disaffected nobles. Memnon had learned a lot about Alexander and the Macedonians from his time as one of those disaffected nobles. By the time Alexander got his Asiatic campaign underway, Memnon knew a lot about the Macedonian mindset, and Alexander, in turn, knew a lot about the general commanding his opposition's forces. Alexander and Memnon were an intriguing matched pair with a shared history and decidedly mutual respect. When Alexander came marching into Persian territory, Memnon urged Darius to undermine Alexander back home. Understanding that Greek politics could shift on a whim, if Darius threw some more gold around and said the right things to fire up Demosthenes, maybe another revolt would break out and Alexander would have to head home to deal with it. It was a good plan. Darius should have listened. Memnon also urged the local governors to enact a scorched earth policy, burning all the crops ahead of Alexander's arrival. This would have made it much harder for Alexander to provision his army so far from home. This was also good advice. Darius should have listened to this too. But Darius was skeptical of Memnon, who had been caught up in the swirling tide of Persian politics. Darius sidelined his mercenary Greek general and entrusted the command of his armies to people of more certain loyalties. To be fair to Darius, it was the Persian custom to leave the defensive territory up to the local satraps, and when Alexander invaded, that was the initial strategy that Darius relied upon. At this point, it's worth highlighting just who this Darius III guy is. After all, he's the undisputed ruler of the kingdom that Alexander is trying to conquer. Nearly a quarter century older than Alexander, Darius III acceded to the Persian throne within a few months of Alexander's own accession in Macedonia. Far from a coddled princeling, Darius rose through the ranks of the Persian political hierarchy through a combination of military and bureaucratic competence. He was battle-tested, having led armies with great success, and he won a reputation for his personal bravery. He came to power when a devious court retainer assassinated both of his predecessors, but managed to hold on to power when he outsmarted that retainer, turned the tables, and then had that regicide killed. By this time, the kingship had drifted away from the descendants of the mighty Achaemenid family, but it appears that Darius III was related to the famous clan, and thus, under his rule, Persia was helmed by an Achaemenid once again. When Alexander brought his army over into Asia Minor, he performed an ancient ritual, throwing his spear into Persian soil and, in echoes of the martial spirit of Achilles, declaring that he had come to avenge those killed in Xerxes' invasion of Greece. This was a pretty flimsy pretense for war. It's probably why Alexander later invented Darius III's confession of his involvement in Philip's assassination. Still, here he was, armed to the teeth and roaming about in Persian territory. Memnon was dishing out sage advice, but Darius trusted his local satraps to swat away this Macedonian nuisance. We can forgive Darius for being a bit dismissive. Not only was he on his home turf, but he had also almost unlimited resources to draw upon. Once he was away from home, Alexander would have to live off the land and scrounge for food, fodder for his horses, water, everything. The longer the Greco-Macedonian army was off in foreign territory, the harder it would be to keep it in the field. Given the massive dimensions of the Persian Empire, delay and indecisive action was a decent enough strategy. The first battle between the disorganized and a bit dismissive Persian forces and the very much organized and focused Macedonian ones took place in May 334 BCE near the river Granicus, not far from the site of ancient Troy. And yes, in case you're wondering, Troy seems to have been a real place, and there are archaeological remains with evidence of catastrophic destruction dating to the time period the epic war allegedly occurred. It seems very likely that the heroic tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey are very, very lightly grounded in actual historical events. The Battle of Granicus itself was short and chaotic. This battle is noteworthy because it was the first engagement in what became a long war of conquest and because it woke Darius up to the severity of the Macedonian threat. At one point in the bloody hand-to-hand fighting, two of the Persian satraps, brothers named Rosicles and Spitamenes, saw Alexander in the middle of the action. They both took off after the king, rightly assessing that if they could kill him, then they could end this thing in one fell swoop. Rosicles cut his way to Alexander and swung his sword, smashing it against the king's head. But Alexander's helmet, fortunately for him, absorbed most of the blow. His helmet cracked in half, though, and with now a bloody scalp, Alexander responded quickly and stabbed Rosicles in the ribs before the satrap could bring down his sword and finish the job. Spitamenes then closed with Alexander, approaching the king from behind. Alexander was unaware of the satrap, who raised his arm to stab Alexander with his lance and kill the now vulnerable king. At that moment, one of Alexander's senior commanders rushed in on horseback, swung his own sword, and cut off Spitamenes' arm. The severed limb fell to the ground, still holding the lance. "'Tis but a flesh wound." Spitamenes died, and the battle turned into a complete rout. Battlefield casualties, especially ancient ones, are very difficult to quantify with any degree of reliability, but Alexander's forces seem to have lost fewer than 150 total men, infantry and cavalry together, and the Persians lost thousands to death, injury, or capture. Ironically, perhaps, more Greeks died fighting as mercenaries for Persia than did fighting for Alexander. Granicus was a rout, but it roused Darius to attention and to take the situation more seriously. Perhaps understanding that he should have listened to Memnon in the first place, Darius gave the Greek mercenary captain license to take charge and lead the resistance. Making up for lost time, Memnon threw himself into the task with great vigor and skill. Memnon gathered up the remnants of Persian forces, reinforced them with local troops, and made a stand outside the city of Halicarnassus, home to the Mausoleum, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The two armies clashed outside the city, and it was a hard-fought affair. The two sides slugged it out, and as the day progressed, the forces of Memnon got the upper hand. Just before he could deliver the knockout punch, a detachment of Alexander's troops breached the city walls and broke in. This rendered Halicarnassus indefensible, and Memnon set fire to the city and withdrew. But Memnon and the Persians had a distinct advantage over the Macedonian invaders: a strong navy close at hand, well-trained, veteran, and itching to get in a fight. Alex might rule the land, at least locally, but at this time, Persia ruled the seas. Memnon decided to use this to his advantage and to put the Macedonians on their back foot. While Alexander rested up to recover from these battles, Memnon deployed the Persian navy to invade and take Greek islands, with, apparently, the ultimate goal of forcing Alexander to withdraw to defend his home turf. Memnon also stirred up political disaffection back in Greece, negotiating an alliance with those pesky Spartans who would never acknowledge Macedonian hegemony, to declare war and attack the Macedonians from within their own backyard. Memnon also encouraged Demosthenes to do his thing, and the firebrand again began his usual punditry, seeking to goad the Athenians into a revolt. Not to take too far a detour here, but Sparta did send their phalanxes marching, and eventually the guy Alexander left in charge back at home, Antipater, the same guy that had Alexander sworn in as king in front of the army just after Philip's death, marched to meet the Spartans and utterly obliterated them. This encounter really marks the firm end of Sparta as a force to be reckoned with. From here on out, they're coasting on reputation. Memnon's aggressive action and clever strategy was proving deeply problematic for the Macedonian invaders. The mercenary captain was Alexander's equal in cunning and bravado. But, in one of those historical twists that leaves us wondering what if, Memnon died in 333 BCE, finishing up the conquest of the Greek island of Lesbos. It's hard to say how things might have been different had he been able to put his plans into full effect. Alexander must have sighed with relief when he found out that his rival had died. He celebrated by taking Memnon's widow, Barsine, as his own mistress. Alexander followed this success by marching all around and liberating the Greek Ionian cities. He also began appointing his own guys to take the place of the displaced Persian satraps. But Alexander didn't engineer a wholesale restructuring of the newly conquered territory. Rather, he kept the infrastructure in place but replaced the Persian satraps with Hellenic nobles and generals. This brings us to one of the best-known anecdotes about Alexander's life and career. In the city of Gordion, in what is today central Turkey, the priest at the temple of Zeus kept a wagon that was tied to a pole via an intricate knot. The priest foretold that anyone who could unfasten the knot would be destined to rule all of Asia. Unable to resist, in 333 BCE, Alexander tried his hand at untying the knot. After all, he was possessed of a preternatural intelligence. Check out the big brain on Alex. He tried, and he tried, and he tried. In short order, he was stumped, having no more luck than anyone else. But the Macedonian king just couldn't fathom not fulfilling the prophecy and ruling all of Asia. He drew his sword, and he cut the knot in half, severing it and fulfilling the prophecy. After all, no one specified how the knot had to be untied. Today, the idiom "cut the Gordian knot" means to get straight to the heart of the matter and to dispense with superfluous details. Every time I hear this story, I wonder what the priests felt watching Alexander obliterate their one claim to fame with the swing of the sword. I wonder if the Gordion Chamber of Commerce tried to plan a new novelty to lure in tourists. Alexander was on a roll. He was emboldened by his battlefield successes and further buoyed by the add on top the fun of fulfilling the Gordian knot prophecy, and Alexander was riding high. He renewed his conquest of Persia with great vigor. His counterpart, Darius III, having been awakened out of his torpor by Alexander's string of victories, finally mobilized his forces into action. He eschewed the Persian tradition of leaving contests to local satraps and instead took direct command of the Persian military. Before squaring off against his surging Macedonian counterpart, Darius spent considerable time preparing and assembling a massive army. He wanted to smash Alexander, not only to win back his territory and to defend his empire, but also to teach this arrogant Argead king a lesson or two. Much of Alexander's approach had rankled Darius. One thing that had really bothered the King of Kings was that Alexander had the audacity to appoint governors over what Darius saw as Persian territory. Another was that Alexander started minting coins with his own image to replace the local currency within these contested areas. The war between the two powers was raging, and Alexander was strutting around like he had already won. Just who did this kid think he was? A year and a half after Granicus, Darius was ready to take out his huge new force and personally square off against the cocky Macedonian. After all sorts of maneuvering, the two forces faced one another near the town of Issus. There is huge variance in the ancient sources about the force that Darius brought to bear. Some say it was 250,000. Others state 600,000. Most modern historians think that even the smaller number here was greatly embellished. Regardless of the size of the forces, Darius seems to have outnumbered Alexander. Reasonable numbers for each are about 100,000 total men for Darius and about 40,000 for Alexander. Now remember that as Alexander had rolled up territory across Anatolia, he had to leave behind troops to garrison the cities. Paradoxically, each victory meant he drew down his forces just a little bit, and by the time the two faced one another near Issus, Darius had a 2.5 to 3 to 1 troop advantage over the Macedonians. Mind you, Darius had been building, preparing, training. He was ready, and now he was about to square off against Alexander. Darius was confident in his ability to win the day and end this Macedonian farce. It would be fun. So much fun that he brought his family to watch. Darius' mother, wife, daughters, they all accompanied the king on his campaign. So too did many powerful satraps and elites of the Persian nobility. Alexander, as always, took personal command of the companion cavalry, which he arrayed on the right. Parmenio led the allied, i.e. non-Macedonian cavalry on the left. Darius placed himself in the middle of his lines, surrounded by the best of his heavy cavalry and the elite corps of Greek mercenary heavy infantry. Even with Memnon dead, the Persian king still had poured out gold to bolster his armies with Greek soldiers. Again, people get super into battlefield movements, but there's nothing particular in this fight itself that is revelatory to the character of Alexander. So, one of the most consequential battles of the ancient world will now be summarized in 11 sentences. The two sides lined up across from one another with a river in between them. Parmenio, that cunning and veteran battlefield commander, engaged the larger Persian forces arrayed up opposite of him, more than holding his own and pinning down the Persians. The Macedonian center had a rough go of it at first, having to cross a river and charge uphill into the teeth of the cream of the Persian forces. On the far side of the battlefield, Alexander's shock cavalry charged across the river, smashed their opponents to pieces, easily scattering their counterparts, and turned left into the exposed flank of the Persian center. From here, the battle grew intense, and, as at Granicus, bloody hand-to-hand fighting ensued. While the two sides were slashing away at one another, Alexander and Darius locked eyes. Alexander, his blood fully up, began hacking his way towards Darius, hell-bent on killing or capturing the Persian king. He was so focused on this glorious task that he paid no mind when a Persian soldier drew a dagger and slashed open Alexander's thigh. Nevertheless, he pressed on towards Darius, fixated on his mission. Meanwhile, the horses pulling Darius' chariot, shot so full of arrows and in searing pain, panicked and took off, carrying their king straight into the Greek lines. Darius found himself alone, with no armor, weapons, or bodyguards. Sensing that the Macedonian victory was total, he mounted a fresh horse and fled. If you were counting, that was 11. Mine goes to 11. And yes, this is the second time I've made the same pop culture reference in the course of this series, but that line is worth it. Fleeing the battlefield was the only option left to Darius. While he is portrayed in Greek sources as cowardly, this is unfair. The Persian king was the Persian Empire. He wasn't just saving himself, he was trying to save the whole thing. His intent was to rally the survivors and to reorganize his efforts and push back against the Greco-Macedonian onslaught. After all, he may have lost Asia Minor to Alexander, but he still had a huge empire from which to raise new troops and fight back. Even without Asia Minor, the scale of the Persian Empire was staggering, especially when compared against the puny Macedonian one. Distance, resources, manpower, money, all of them kept the Persians in the fight. They just needed to regroup, and Darius could only organize this effort if he was alive. His troops tried to follow their king from the battlefield, retreating in a frenzy. But Alexander's troops followed in hot pursuit and slaughtered every one they could. As many as 20,000 Persians died at Issus, with Alexander losing roughly 7,000. Still, given the distance from home, this loss for Alexander was not insubstantial. Given the resources available to him, Darius was positioned to replace troops with greater ease. With each Macedonian lost, gone too was the training, the experience, the ability to handle the Sarissa. This should have been a mere setback for the King of Kings. A tactical loss, perhaps, maybe a strategic draw. But as Alexander's men gave chase to the fleeing Persians, they came across Darius' camp. As was to be expected, given his status, the Persian HQ was loaded with luxury goods and treasure. The Macedonians greedily fell on the camp, looting everything they could, except for Darius' personal goods, as these could only be claimed by Alexander himself. Alex looked around, satisfied with the day's astonishing triumph, and ordered a bath to be drawn in Darius' bathtub. Alexander kept pressing his advantage. He soon overtook and captured the Persian supply train, including Darius' royal harem. This is critical. The king's mother, wife, daughters, even his heir, were now in the hands of his avowed enemy. Alexander treated the Persian noblewomen with great respect and deference, as he believed their status deserved. But he held on to them. Possessing the royal harem gave Alexander tremendous power. Darius was devastated, near hysterics. He concluded that this war was not worth the trouble, and that he valued his family more than the entirety of his kingdom. A distraught Darius made multiple overtures to Alexander, suing for peace, offering half his kingdom in exchange for his family, offering a ransom of 10,000 talents, an ungodly sum of gold and silver, for their return, even offering the hand of his daughter to cement a marriage alliance. For a moment, Alexander paused, contemplating whether or not to take the offer. Without one more battle, one more life lost, Alexander would become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world. He would double, even triple the amount of land under his command, and crucially, by seizing and taking control of the land between Macedonia and the Persian heartlands, Alexander would both control some of the wealthiest and most agriculturally productive land in the known world, but he would also have a huge buffer between his heartland and that of his dreaded enemy in case his alliance fell apart. In just a few short years of campaigning, he would surpass his father, to that point, the greatest conqueror anyone had ever known. But still, what might be accomplished if he just kept going, kept fighting, kept chasing Darius from one end of the Persian Empire to the other? At one point, Alexander conveyed his senior generals and asked whether he should accept the terms. In a story that's likely apocryphal, Parmenio told Alexander, "I would take it if I were Alexander," to which Alexander replied, "I would take it too, if I were Parmenio." Eventually, Alexander scoffed and waved off these overtures, replying that it was he who would get to offer terms to Darius and not the other way around. Darius realized the only way to get his mother, wife, daughters, and heir back would be to crush Alexander on the battlefield and take them back by force. He got to work planning, rebuilding. No more underestimating the 20-something young Alexander. Darius was fully paying attention now. For his part, Alexander got some ideas about how to take advantage of Persia's tenuous position. Rather than keep chasing Darius around the empire, Alexander left the king to his own devices and turned south to conquer another ancient kingdom, one that long chafed under Persian rule and was itching for liberation: Egypt. There was a problem, though. Memnon had known that one area where Persia definitely had an advantage was at the sea. Marching along the western Mediterranean coast and into Egypt would leave Alexander's forces vulnerable to attack from the sea. He knew that he needed to reduce the city of Tyre to prevent it from becoming a base of operation for his enemies to disrupt his advances. We first met Tyre when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city for 13 years before finally giving up and forming a face-saving alliance with the Tyrian king. Nominally independent, the city of Tyre was from the seafaring and commercially minded Phoenicians, an independent and very much trade-oriented people. The Tyrians also provided safe harbors for the Persian navy and for their elite officer corps. Tyre claimed independence and neutrality, but its close relationship with Persia was a significant factor in the local theater of war. Alexander marched to Tyre and gave the city a choice: surrender or face his wrath. To the Tyrians, this was hilarious, and it seemed like a hollow threat. Tyre had held off long sieges in the past, including from those dreaded Babylonians. They could resupply themselves by sea. They had everything they needed to laugh off the threat. They slaughtered Alexander's emissaries and tossed their bodies into the ocean. How did Alexander think he was going to take their city? It's worth taking a moment to ask, what made the Tyrians so cocky? How had they held out against Nebuchadnezzar for more than a decade, and why were they so quick to wave off Alexander's blustering? It all came down to geography. Tyre occupied an island a little less than a half-mile offshore. Despite being tantalizingly close to the mainland, the waters surrounding Tyre required strong ocean-going vessels to navigate. With ships only able to move with the wind, the Tyrians could see an enemy approaching with ease. To top it all off, the island was rigged on all sides by a formidable set of thick walls, which were punctuated by looming towers and strong fortifications. The Tyrians had seen a would-be conqueror approach the city bent on conquest, and just as often had seen those same armies skulk away, tails between their legs. The Tyrians didn't take Alexander lightly. He had gained a reputation. But as the Tyrian slaughter of Alexander's emissaries proved, they were determined to resist. They sent most of the women and children away to their sister city, Carthage, leaving 40,000 grimly determined defenders committed to repulsing Alexander. For an army without much of a navy, taking such a city would be a daunting task. But, and I'm not sure I've mentioned this before, Alexander overflowed with ambition. A few logistical difficulties like those presented by Tyre were not going to stop him. But what to do? His army couldn't float, they couldn't walk on water, and the Persians had naval supremacy. Any attempt he would make to sail over would be obliterated before his ships even left port. Any projectiles like arrows or rocks hurled by catapults would splash harmlessly in the deep sea. Alexander could not use a navy to bring his army across the sea, but he resolved to bend the sea to his will. Alexander ordered his troops to begin construction on a causeway across the open water, so that he could bring his army right up to the walls of Tyre. Cowed by the presence of the mighty Macedonians, local rulers chipped in building materials and labor. Foundation rocks were sunk, then layers built on top of them. The causeway rose from the depths and toward the surface. Then, slowly, relentlessly, the causeway then began to creep across the waters towards Tyre. Maybe Alexander would be able to walk on water after all. It was grueling, time-consuming work. Foundation, support, structure, a level surface area. He was trying to build a 65-foot highway across the water. At first, the task was greatly aided by sandbars that rose close to the surface. But this only closed the gap part way. As they got closer to the city, Alexander's engineers needed to build deeper foundations to reflect the deeper waters. As the causeway crept closer to Tyre, the soldiers came into range of the Tyrian archers who fired their arrows at the Macedonians. This forced the troops to don their heavy armor, moving heavy rocks and rubble in the searing heat, fully loaded with bronze armor. Not fun for the guys. Then the seafloor dropped to a depth of nearly 20 feet. Under constant fire from the Tyrian soldiers and ships, and facing an unprecedented challenge, Alexander dug in his heels. He ordered 2 siege towers erected and positioned at the end of the causeway so that his soldiers could return the Tyrian fire. He had wooden palisades erected around the leading edge of the construction. He essentially turned the end of this road in progress into a heavily fortified camp to shelter his men so they could keep advancing the causeway, inch by grueling inch. It dawned on the Tyrians that Alexander had figured out a plan that posed a genuine threat to their city. Shooting arrows and slinging rocks down on the Macedonians was not going to be sufficient. It was time to launch a counterattack. They leaned on their biggest advantage, their control of the seas. The Tyrians packed an old cargo ship full of combustible materials, and they hung cauldrons full of bubbling, hot oil from the ship's rigging. They weighed down the tail of the ship so the bow would rise clear out of the water. Then 2 warships, one on either side, tied themselves to the fire ship. They lit this on fire and crashed the floating inferno and both warships into the causeway, igniting Alexander's fortifications and starting a searing conflagration. Adept seafarers that they were, the Tyrians all jumped in the water and swam to safety. As Alexander's troops rushed to try to douse the flames, a swarm of small boats flooded out of Tyre's harbor, and troops landed on the causeway, engaging Alexander's troops in hand-to-hand combat to prevent them from putting out the fires. It was a brilliant counteroffensive, and at the end of the day, the Tyrian attack left the causeway a smoldering ruin. Months of grueling work, including millions and millions of pounds of rock hauled into place, was undone in a matter of hours. Furious, but not deterred, not ever deterred, Alexander strengthened his resolve. He ordered the causeway doubled in width, with an increased number of fortifications and firepower, and told the men to get back to work. Seeking to prevent the Tyrians from simply doing the same thing again, Alexander leaned on all the surrounding countries to provide ships and crews to join the war effort. By shaking down the local territories, Alexander secured for himself a huge fleet. Augmented by these donations, Alexander now had 220 ships at his command, a fleet of even bigger than the Tyrian fleet, and one that could eliminate the advantage that the Persians still enjoyed. Isolated in their offshore citadel, the Tyrians had no idea they were now vastly outnumbered. As his soldiers resumed the work on the second causeway, Alex took his new navy out for a spin. What followed was an epic back and forth of move and countermove between Alexander and the Tyrians. They blocked their harbors with boulders. Alexander's ships tied ropes to the rocks and towed them away. The Tyrians cut the ropes. Alexander switched to metal chains. Alexander's ships loaded up with battering rams, and they got to work ramming the walls in an attempt to open a breach. The Tyrians dumped scalding oil on Alexander's ships and crews and showered down rocks and arrows. The Tyrians launched a naval assault, confronting Alexander in open water. At first this was successful, but Alexander's navy regrouped and counterattacked. All the while all these moves and countermoves were taking place, Alexander's men just kept inching the causeway forward. By land, by sea, Alexander slowly and relentlessly strangled the valiant city. When the end came for Tyre, it came in a fury. Alexander personally led his men over the walls and into the city. 6,000 Tyrians were slaughtered in the fighting. 2,000 more were captured and crucified on the beach. The rest, about 30,000, were sold into slavery. Alexander marched his troops through the city in triumph. All told, he lost about 4,000 men in taking Tyre and to vanquishing its 40,000 defenders. He accomplished this in 7 months. He did in these few months what Nebuchadnezzar hadn't been able to do in 13 years. The story of the siege and sack of Tyre is not necessarily one of great strategic importance. Sure, Alexander didn't want to leave a strongly fortified enemy naval base with the ability to operate behind his lines as he progressed south. In the grand sweep of his career, Tyre was just one more city out of hundreds, maybe thousands, that he would either conquer or cow into submission. But the siege is revelatory and thus worth spending some time focusing on. As we try to get inside the mind of Alexander, there are a few incidents from his career that summarize who he was, quite like this one. He was relentless, he was resolute, he was undeterred. Nothing was going to stop this guy. He was clever and innovative, coming up with solutions to challenges no one else had considered. He willed his army and navy to success where no one had ever succeeded before, and he proved just how furious he could be when his blood was up. Crucifying 2,000 Tyrians for the sin of fighting to protect their homeland was a particularly gruesome finale to Alexander's project. In Alexander's bloodlust, we find none of the basic humanity of Cyrus, who understood that people value their freedom and shouldn't be resented for their attempts to maintain it. This brings us to our pause in the story for today. We've covered a lot of ground, with Alexander coming crashing into Persian territory and beginning to roll up a series of victories that would put him on fast track to being recognized as Alexander the Great. And yet, despite how much we've discussed in the first 3 parts of this episode, we have a lot of fascinating things to cover in the brilliant but short life of Alexander. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we follow Alexander as he gears up to take on an epic conquest and to subdue an ancient land of fascination, power, and mystery, Egypt.